All right, hi, I'm John Moran. I am the team leader, founder of Smart Beach Investor. This is Mark Violette, the owner of Mark Violette PA title company.
So I'm a law firm that handles real estate closings.
Boom.
Yep.
Law firm that handles real estate closings. He's a perfect guy to talk to because what I want to talk about today is financing. We're going to talk about wraparound mortgages, owner financing, lease purchases, option to lease purchase. And we're going to talk about it from a legal standpoint, which is why Mark's here, because he's a genius when it comes to doing this stuff, right? He's a good guy to know.
Hard to disagree with that.
It is hard to disagree, right? So, but he's good, and that's why we have him in. So, Mark, real quick, tell us a 1 minute story about your background. Who's Mark Violette?
So I was licensed in Florida in 1998. So we're in 2024. So I've been doing this for a couple of years, and my primary focus is pretty much anything tied to real estate, whether it's seller financing, doing closings, drafting leases, do some sale of businesses.
Love it.
Yep.
Love it. So you've done a lot of closings. You've done this. We went through the downturn back in the crisis, and we went through the upturn again recently, and now here we are back where we are. So we've been doing this a long time. All right. So I want to talk about financing because here's my thing. I'm on a crusade to help people live big lives in retirement, right? I want them to be able to build their wealth using cash flowing real estate, vacation rentals specifically. But I know a big issue with this is I can't afford it. I don't know how. The banks are crazy, all this stuff. So today, Mark, I want you to help us understand a couple alternatives. So let's start right off the bat. There's so much talk about this wraparound mortgage stuff because a lot of people have low mortgage rates that they got into during COVID, and the banks were so low, 2-3%, right? And now the banks are at what, 7, 8, 9%? And that creates a good spread that some people talk about. Well, if you have a 3% mortgage and the bank is charging 9%, there's a 6% spread. So what if I sell my house to Mr. Buyer over here and I sell it to him at a 6%? I keep the extra 3% and they save 3% from going to the bank. That's a wraparound mortgage, is that right?
In theory. So what a wraparound means is you're wrapping around something.
Okay.
So the existing seller has a mortgage,
Yeah.
and both the seller and the buyer do not plan on paying that mortgage off.
Oh.
So then what happens is...
Initially. They plan to eventually pay it off, just not at the sale or
not
the
at
transfer.
sale.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
So what you're doing is the seller is essentially wrapping around their mortgage and giving a mortgage to the buyer. Now the concern...
Hold on. Let's just so we're clear. The seller has a mortgage with the bank. They're keeping that mortgage. They're going to sell the property to you at a new mortgage with a higher rate. You pay the seller pays the bank every month until that thing is paid off.
That is the theory behind a wraparound mortgage.
Okay. But there's some issues.
There are. So most standard mortgages in paragraph 18 have what we call a due on transfer clause. So what that means is if the lender finds out that the existing seller, who is the borrower, has now transferred the property to somebody else. We're not going to talk about if they formed a trust or an LLC. This is somebody they're not affiliated with. If the lender sees that has happened in the public records, the mortgage is going to say the lender can send a notice to the seller, give them 30 days to transfer the property back into their name, and if they don't do that, then the lender can say pay us off in full.
So there's some jeopardy.
Correct.
Okay. And we don't think this is a great way to go.
Correct, because when the seller or whoever handles that closing between the seller and buyer, when the deed is recorded, notice goes to the property appraiser's office, who then notifies the tax collector's office. So traditionally, when the next taxes come due, the tax bill, usually when the seller has a lender, is paid by the lender because they've been escrowing for taxes and insurance. Tax bill goes to the lender, they look and they go, who is John Smith? That is not our borrower. And that's what triggers the event that the lender knows to notify the seller, who is this, what's going on?
So, but they're legal. Wraparound mortgages are legal.
They're legal, they just possibly create a default for the seller.
Right. So just, if you're gonna do one, be careful. All right, they're a little bit convoluted, but some people are doing it. Some people are doing them.
So there's usually two different types of lenders. We have what we call securitized lenders. Those are ones that go to the normal service providers where everybody says my lender has changed 3 times. That's a securitized loan. And then you have what we call banks, where they keep the loan in their house. Sometimes with those, you can actually go to the bank.
Not in their house, in their business.
Right, in-house in the business. But you can actually go to them and they will agree to allow more of a wraparound.
Okay. But it's tough because the bank's losing a lot of its leverage once you, who they agreed to lend to, in turn send it to somebody else that they may not agree to lend to. So it's a thing. It can happen. We recommend against it, generally speaking.
And I traditionally will not actually participate in the wraparounds because usually they end badly if the payments are not being made.
Yeah, and that's always an issue.
And a good example too is if the buyer has the title of the property, let's say they've been making the payments to the lender for 2 years.
Okay.
And now we'll call it the buyer, but the new owner says, hey, I want to sell it.
Yeah.
How does the new buyer get a payoff from the seller's lender when the seller's lender will not talk to the buyer? So
wraparound
right.
Can work. Careful.
The reason they call it is because you really can't wrap your head around it.
Yeah, be careful. Okay, so there's that. Love it. We covered wraparound mortgages. Okay, we got that covered. Now, there's other ways to do it, and I know there's a lot of talk about owner financing, seller finance is a good way to go, right? Because this is when basically the seller acts as the bank. They create a down payment they're willing to take. They create the interest payment they're willing to accept. They create an amortization, easy for me to say, chart, right? That shows where all the money's going, how long, terms, conditions, all that. Buyer and seller agree. The only difference between this and a bank is the seller is acting as the bank.
Correct.
And generally, it's a little bit easier than what banks require. Generally, the down payment's a little less, the interest rates are a little less, and all that kind of stuff. And again, maybe the seller has either no mortgage. Do they have to have a no mortgage situation, or could they have a mortgage?
So as long as the down payment pays off the existing mortgage, if they have one, then you can do it.
All right. So they either have a low mortgage or no mortgage, and they're willing to work with you. Okay. So they give you a good rate. You get better than a bank, and it's just a little bit easier. Now let's talk about the pros and cons from your aspect as an attorney dealing with this kind of stuff.
Right, so if the so you have to look at it from which side you're, I guess, protecting. So a seller, obviously they're giving their house to a new buyer, so the deed will transfer into the buyer.
At closing.
Correct.
Through an attorney.
Correct.
Okay.
So their concern is what happens if the buyer never makes the payment, never makes the first payment. So traditionally what I'll tell a seller is, what you're looking for is getting the most down payment from the buyer possible without killing the deal. Now, if you want to go to what I would call the minimum amount, usually the question is, okay, well, let's assume the buyer never makes the payment. What do I have to go through to get the property back?
Oh, how do I get it back? How do I repo or foreclose?
Right, in Florida, we call them foreclosures.
No.
So if they hire a local attorney, most of the time they could probably get through maybe 10 to 15,000 legal fees. So when we're talking about how much you need to get from the buyer, I start with a minimum 10 to 15,000 down. Anything more than that, then they're basically covered. So even if they never make their first payment, they're still going to get the property back and probably have some equity in it.
And in all fairness, if you're a seller doing owner financing, you want to get the money on the regular. You're helping out the buyer, one, right, generally speaking, but you want to make it good for you. And so now you're getting the bank's interest, right? So you're getting your principal and the interest instead of the bank, right?
Correct.
Okay. And in theory, if the buyer craps out 5 years, is this a 30-year, 7? How long?
So it's all negotiable between the buyer and the seller.
Okay. All right. Is there a normal? Is there, like, generally speaking, at least in my world, it's usually like a 1, 3, or maybe even 5-year balloon type of thing, and then they refi through a bank at some point?
So what will traditionally happen, and again, completely negotiable between the parties, but the seller doesn't want to be tied to this buyer for 30 years.
Right.
So a standard seller financing would be a certain amount down, You take the remainder principal balance, you'll amortize it over 30 years. What that does is makes those monthly payments less. But then, like you said, usually 1 year is not enough for the buyer to either establish credit or to get enough equity where then they can go to a bank and pay it off. So
you look at 3 to 5.
Usually 3 to 5 years, correct.
All right, and then if the buyer craps out sometime in that way, the seller gets the property back and either keeps it or resells it to somebody else, and they have the principal and interest that they've already collected.
Correct.
So that's a little bit of protection for them.
Right.
Now the buyer wants to do this. Why?
So the benefits for the buyer, obviously, one, you're not involving a bank, so you don't have to go through all the financial qualifications that you normally do. On a closing statement, traditionally, if you have a lender involved, take the sales price times a couple percentage. So if it's in our area, you're looking at a minimum purchase of $400,000. So maybe $10,000 to $15,000 in closing cost. You can take those closing costs that you would just give to a bank, and you can use that as your down payment to the seller. It's more streamlined. Usually the seller is offering a better interest rate, which keeps your payments lower.
Yeah, it's a good way to go if maybe your credit's a little soft. Maybe you're self-employed. This is good for self-employed type of people. And it's a better way to get started.
And there's one more. If you're an investor, banks will only allow you to own a certain amount of investment property, where sellers don't necessarily care. You can go out and buy 10 of them if you can find 10 sellers willing to do it.
Yeah. So it's a good way to go if you're a investor, if you're a questionable buyer just getting started, which a lot of our investors are, right? It's a good way to get started. This is seller or owner financing. It's a really good way to go. Okay, so there's a third aspect to this alternative type of financing, and that'd be a lease purchase, a rent-to-own type of situation, right?
Correct.
And this is when it's similar to the owner financing, only you're not transferring ownership initially. It comes at the end of the lease period, right?
Correct.
So how does that work from your perspective?
So sometimes people may not have the down payment that a seller would want. So what they're going to do is they're going to lease the property, usually 12 months, could be 24.
Like a normal apartment type of lease or home lease.
Correct. You're going to have 2 documents in this situation. You're going to have a lease, just like you would normally have a lease.
Okay.
And then attached to it is going to be what we call a sale and purchase agreement.
Okay.
So basically the parties most of the time will agree to a sales price, even though closing won't occur for maybe a year or 2. So the benefit there is, assuming we're having an appreciation in property values, the tenant, who is the buyer, is securing today's price in the lease purchase, and they're hoping in a year or 2 from now when they go to close, the property has appreciated and they've locked in the lower price, which gives them instant equity.
Yep, or they somehow came into some money, or they saved some money, inherited, or somehow won a lottery or whatever the case is, right? Now that's good because it gives the seller a sale, but they're not getting a down payment?
No, not under this situation. And it's negotiable. They could do a security agreement. And sometimes what they'll do is, depending on the situation, whether it's a buyer's market or seller's market, sometimes in the lease itself, they may, let's say fair market value for a lease was $2,000. They may make the payments $3,000, and then say $1,000 of the $3,000 goes towards an EMD, where if the buyer closed, now they've built up $12,000 of cash into an EMD already. Okay,
and the EMD is just the earnest money deposit that you give to show you're in this thing.
Correct.
Okay.
So it's a good way for a buyer who doesn't have a lot of liquid cash to start building up equity in the property, so when it's time to close, they have the funds.
Great way to get into this is a lease purchase. Now, do you have to live in it? Right? Because generally when I think lease purchase, I'm gonna take a lease, I'm gonna move into this place and whatever. Or can I do a lease purchase as some sort of investment? Does that work?
Well, I guess, so normally, traditionally, the lease, the buyer is going to live in the property and use it probably as a primary residence.
I'm just trying to think from a vacation rental standpoint. Is there an opportunity here from a vacation rental to get in that perhaps you don't live in?
I think that would take a special seller, because ultimately from a seller standpoint, what you're hearing is your property is now going to have maybe 50 different families running through it. You are the owner of it. You worry about liability. You worry about maintenance of it. You worry about maintaining it. So that would complicate it.
What this is the Airbnb arbitrage, right? Where you tell somebody who owns something, and then you run it as an Airbnb because you think you can get the
Right.
spread.
And you would want to cover that in the lease if that's what the plan
I
is.
see. And some people do that quite successfully. Risky.
Right.
Risky. Okay, now maybe this is going to be a future vacation rental in 2 years or 3 years, and and you live here, or it's going to be a short-term rental wherever you are, and you're willing to live in it for a year to get it established, get yourself established, and then in the future it's going to turn into whatever. Then it works.
Right.
Okay. Now, the difference in a lease option or a lease purchase and a lease option, what does that look like?
So a lease purchase, again, is 2 documents, which is the lease stated for duration, and then it says you will purchase the property on whatever the closing date is.
Okay.
The lease option says you're going to lease it for a stated period, and then you have the option at the end of it to purchase it or to not purchase it. So you're not bound by a purchase agreement at that point.
Okay. If I'm in, I'm in. If I'm not, cool. Thanks for
Correct.
playing.
And usually with the option, you're not going to have, as we know, the sale and purchase contract is 12 pages, 15 pages. A lease option is going to be 1 document that's going to have an additional paragraph that may discuss the major terms. But normally it'll say something to the effect of, if the buyer's going to exercise their options, the parties agree to go get an appraisal to see what the fair market value is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little less concrete on terms.
Okay, perfect. All right, Mark. So our goal here today was to introduce folks to some alternatives to banker, right? Even to hard lending, which we can talk about before or another time. So you got wraparound mortgages. They're out there, but be very, very, very careful. Okay. We have owner financing, classic, good way to go, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Safer. Yeah.
Safe for all parties. Then we have a lease purchase, which is nice because you get into the property before you have to buy it, and it gives you some latitude. Is that fair?
Correct.
And then the lease purchase with an option gives you even more flexibility.
Yeah, so I think the primary thing is it depends on how much money the buyer has to put down.
Mm-hmm.
If you have more money to put down, you're probably looking at owner financing. If you don't have money, you're probably looking towards a lease purchase, spreading it out, maybe increasing the rent so some of your funds can go towards a down payment.
Perfect. So if you're thinking about getting into investing in real estate, specifically vacation rentals, you're smart. We're wealth builders. This is what we do, right? This is what we do. We want you to live a big life in retirement. And all these things are long-term plays, right? Mark, you're an investor. Long-term is the way to go.
Real estate long-term, correct.
Get in, stay in, and realize the reward from that. Investing rewards long play, correct?
Because we're always going to have inflation, and real estate is a hedge against inflation.
Inflation and appreciation works in your favor, and somebody else pays it down over time. Boom, the renter. Boom. Okay, so cool. Our hope here was to introduce alternatives to bank lending.
Correct.
Right? We have wraparound mortgages. We're not real keen on those. They're out there, but we're not real keen. Seller financing is a good way to go for buyers that don't have a lot of credit history or a lot of down payment money, things like that. Lease purchase, another good way to go, a little more flexibility built in, and then the lease purchase with an option is the most flexible. So if you all are thinking about getting into real estate investing and you're concerned about the financing of it, there are many ways to go. Give us an email, info@smartbeachinvestor.com. This is what we do. We want to make sure that you can build your wealth such that you get to live a great life in retirement. Now, Mark, how do we get a hold of you? What's our thing here with you?
So I think for the viewer watching, the key is if you're looking for the property, that's a John Moran thing.
Okay.
Once you've found the property and now you're basically negotiating with the seller and you and the seller have come to maybe some terms, that's where I come into play. In Florida, we have title companies and we have law firms. So title companies can't really handle this type of work. So I'm going to have to draft up usually the seller financing document, which is the promissory note, the mortgage, the amortization schedule, and I will review some of the pros and cons with both the seller and the buyer, so everyone's more aware of what's out there. I know everybody goes 2 feet in thinking it's all going to be rainbows and sunshines, but it's good to go in these things with some knowledge.
Here's the thing, it's a lot of money, people. Get it right. It's hard to fix problems. It's better to get it right first.
Right.
There you go. How do they get a hold of Mark Violette?
So our primary office is in Destin, right next to Keller Williams, but in the same building. You can reach us at 850-424-5562.
There you go.